well, I do feel certain that the silence that Quentin Smith refers to has nothing to do with a sort of confidence on the part of physicists or atheists that these creationists are so incoherent that we'll just not even bother to speak to them about it. And I think anybody familiar with the literature knows this. There's an enormous amount of literature now on the science-religion dialogue in our day. This has almost become a la mode, so to speak. No, that's right, and he is attempting to write on this.
He's not familiar with the issue?
Well, I don't think he is very familiar with the literature. Frankly, I think that he's speaking out of his field here, quite honestly. But he wasn't silent either. But I don't think the silence that Quentin speaks of has anything to do with a sort of incoherence at all. And one would just have to look at the journal literature on it. Secondly, with respect to God's not being an empirical entity and therefore not being susceptible to empirical proof, it seems to me that in science we have all sorts of counterexamples to this, where we have non-empirical entities which are posited, theoretical entities posited as being the sufficient explanation for empirical effects that we observe, so that we have things like electrons and quarks, and some want to talk about strings and even multiple dimensions, higher spatial dimensions. These are non-empirical theoretical entities which are posited to explain empirical effects. And I think in the case of God, one could do much the same thing. Or take an argument like the moral argument for God's existence, where on the basis of our apprehension of moral values, one would argue to God as the locus and embodiment of supreme goodness. This would be an argument that would be in a sense empirical, in that it appeals to some data of experience, namely moral experience, back to God as the ground for that. And finally, the argument from physics not being able to appeal to a metaphysical time. As I lay out the argument in the book, I argue in this way. Premise one, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise two, the universe began to exist. Conclusion, therefore, the universe has a cause. In support of premise two, that the universe began to exist, I offer both philosophical arguments and then scientific confirmation, so that the argument or the evidence from physics is only part of the total case that I would make for the fact that the universe began to exist. And if someone alleges that the notion of a cause of the universe is incoherent, then I think it's perfectly legitimate for me as a philosopher to draw upon metaphysical resources to say, not at all. You can have a cause of the universe which transcends physical time and space and exists in a sort of Newtonian time. So I don't see any problem philosophically in doing that, even though I use physical evidence as part of the confirmation for the beginning of the universe. Did either of you want to jump in on this?
I guess I just want to make one remark, which is that I don't think, and I don't want to be understood as thinking that that there couldn't be any arguments either from empirical evidence or perhaps of some a priori sort for or against the existence of God. I mean, obviously, the fact that God isn't another physical thing makes the case rather special, but I certainly wouldn't be prepared, just knowing that, to jump to the conclusion that there couldn't be arguments that might even be decisive. Perhaps.
This is perhaps the place to say that I was really thinking of a much simpler argument in terms of being pulled back and forth than Professor Craig's use of reflexive kinds of arguments. The main point that I was trying to make is that if you start with certain premises and the conclusions follow, then of course the conclusions are in some sense already embedded in the premises themselves. And if you then have somebody who has other premises and other conclusions follow, then assuming that this is a valid argument, that then it means that you begin questioning the premises. And it seems to me the genuine debate here is what are acceptable premises and how can you hold them? And Greenbaum, I think, would not agree with your premises, or at least rephrase them in certain ways, and you would not agree with his.
Right.
And that's the sense in which it seems to me that most of us get pulled back and forth, not in this reflexive sense that one shouldn't or can't do this. The other point I would want to make here is that, of course, these arguments have been around for thousands of years, and they have been, in some sense, encapsulated in the what are called the Kantian antinomies, where Kant, for example, proves that there is a beginning in time and there is not a beginning in time. Space is finite and space is not finite. And the only reason I mention those arguments is because it seems to me they, in a sense, encapsulate the discussion that had gone on for centuries before about what position one might be able to take. And what Kant, it seems to me, shows is that, again, starting from certain premises, certain conclusions follow, but then he just reverses the premises and then the other conclusion follows. And so the real issue here, it seems to me, is how does one justify the premises to an extent that, in fact, they also include the premises or the objections of a person who has a different point of view. And that, it seems to me, where the reflexive argument is really compelling. If you can get premises that, in fact, are accepted by a person that has another point of view and incorporate them into the premises and still come up with this conclusion, then it seems to me you have a very compelling kind of argument.
I have one comment and one question. That's great. First, I want to thank you for clearing up that whole business about virtual particles. Because that's something that has been always very confusing to me. I'm not trained in physics at all. I mean, I am in physics. My training is actually in philosophy and Smith. And so it had always been a sort of a peculiar thing to me to hear about these virtual particles sort of popping into being. However, I do have one question with respect to principle of sufficient reason as the notion that, let's say, every event must have a cause, or anything that comes to being must have a cause, and so forth, right? Some version of that is what we're going to use for a principle. I think you know full well, I know you know full well, that Quentin Smith does have an argument against the existence of divine creator, the basis of the principle of sufficient reason, whereby he says that certainly the universe is, all that exists in the universe is a series of events and beings, and they all have causes. But when we get down to the point of singularity, he wants to charge that that is not, in fact, in any sense, an event. That is not something that really is going to be within the domain of the principle of sufficient reason, because you don't have an event, a point of singularity. You don't have something really distinguishable from just empty space. I'm not perfectly clear on the argument there, but I think that's the rough sketch of it. And as far as I know, you have some arguments against this. I'd like to hear what they might be.
The question is, with the principle of sufficient cause, does that apply to t equals 0 if t equals 0 is not actually an event?
You've really raised a whole hornet's nest of issues here that could be discussed. Let me try to make it as brief as possible. First of all, the sense in which the singularity isn't an event is a highly technical sense in the general theory of relativity. It's not an event in space-time in the sense that you can specify the coordinates of that point independently of all the other points in the universe. So it's not a space-time event in this highly technical sense that's operative in the theory. But in the philosophical sense of an event as that which happens, it is most certainly an event. In that philosophical or layman sense of the terms, it's something that happens. Or think of it in these terms. The premise as I enunciated is that whatever begins to exist has a cause. Now there you don't even talk about events. And the singularity certainly is something that begins to exist. On Quentin Smith's view, it's the first physical state of the universe. And it hasn't always existed. It exists for vanishingly short, indeed zero amount of time. So that it falls under the universal premise that whatever begins to exist has a cause. A further point that I would argue, and that Quentin and I disagree on, is I don't think the singularity is even a real physical state at all. It seems to me that it's just a mathematical fiction which is ontologically equivalent to nothing. That is to say, an object which occupies zero space and endures for zero time is not really a physical object at all. It's just a mathematical point. And it represents that point at which the universe, as you go back in time, vanishes into non-being. But even if you do regard it as a real physical object, as he does, it still begins to exist and therefore would still require a cause. That would be fundamentally one way in which I'd respond. Another argument that he kind of uses on this whole element is that if you say that the singularity is non-existent or not an event, then you could say that for every instant in the universe as you go back in time, there's always a prior instant. You never come to a first instant. But that doesn't mean that therefore the universe didn't begin to exist. On his own definitions of what it is to begin to exist, time still has a beginning. Time began to exist, and therefore it would still have to have a cause that would bring it into being. So I'm not at all persuaded by this alleged refutation that's been offered.
I have a question for Professor Craig. I'm inspired by Professor Fales' concluding remark. According to St. John's Gospel, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In that claim, I understand no mention of a spatial, temporal, or material beginning. I'm wondering if the creation that we're concerning ourselves here today is not one that the Scriptures are concerned with.
Do you want to repeat the question?
The question is with regard to the Gospel of John, that in the Genesis description there's no reference to time or space or material. So the question is the biblical creation perhaps not even directly bearing on the same sense of space-time creation that we're dealing with today?
Let me take a running start at this question because I do feel strongly about it. Theologians today, people in religious studies, are so scared to death of science that they are afraid to let any theological claim have any empirical content to it, lest somehow science might contradict it. And therefore, in our recent age, there's been a lot of real waffling by theologians on the doctrine of creation out of nothing. It's been reinterpreted and emasculated to mean merely that the universe depends ontologically upon God for its being. And that's certainly a part of the doctrine of creation, that at any moment of its existence, the universe ontologically depends upon God as its ground of being. But if you will do a word study of the notion of creation in the Judeo-Christian Bible, you will find that the concept of creation is virtually everywhere associated with the notion of a temporal beginning. The notion of creation in the Scriptures is everywhere temporal, and not just this weird philosophical relation of ontological dependence, which I think is far too cerebral for what these ancient writers were talking about when they talk about God spoke and the worlds came into being. Now, with respect specifically to John's Gospel, what does he say? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. This is a clear reminiscence of Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But he goes on in John to say about the Word that all things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. That's a clear statement or implication of creatio ex nihilo. Nothing exists outside of God that was not brought into existence, brought into being by the Word. So that in John 1, like Genesis 1, I think you have the implication of creation ex nihilo. The notion that there could have existed alongside of God some uncreated stuff, some dualistic sort of metaphysical primal stuff, would be just utterly unthinkable to these biblical writers who think of the Word or God as the source of all reality outside of God himself. So I think that theologians, and perhaps there are some here in the audience, need to be more courageous, to have more conviction with respect to the doctrines that, that the Christian faith enunciates. And you don't need to be so fearful that these are going to be contradicted. They're true, I think, and therefore I think we can look forward with confidence to these doctrines being empirically verified where they impinge empirically upon the universe.
Would you like to comment on that? Just briefly.
I think in the first place that it's clear that so far as the word itself goes in John, there isn't the implication that that God created the Word. The Word was in the beginning with God, and the Word is God. Okay. The question at issue is whether God created ex nihilo everything that is part of the creation as we understand it. That's a complicated exegetical question. I know, and I'm sure Professor Craig knows, that there are a great many biblical scholars who disagree with him on his interpretation of these passages. And in order to debate that question, one would obviously have to raise the question of what sorts of interpretive options are available with respect to those passages. I can't right off the top of my head sort of recite that passage in Proverbs, but I can at least guess that it might be the case that the reference there is specifically to the chaos waters in Sheol. And of course, God does create Sheol in Genesis, but it doesn't follow from that he created the chaos waters themselves. So matters are rather slippery here, and obviously we're not going to settle that sort of question in 10 minutes of back and forth.
You have a question?
Yeah, but I don't think you're going to be back.
Yeah, I'm getting studied in the story of Jesus, and I think when you say, I like a lot of statements you're making there, but I think you should say most theologians are scared to death.
Granted, of course.
I'm not, because I think that if we essentially are, and you bring something out of John, in search of the truth, that's what it's all about. And, but I think that before we get into quoting scriptures too much, there's just too much in this day and age that says that we've got to take these gospels and it's just the gospels we have to seriously. We've got to look at how they're structured. We've got to go back 2,000 years if we can do that, and we've got to reconstruct the life of Jesus too. I mean, there's a lot involved here before we get even into scientific issues too. So historically, along those lines, I mean, this is why we're here, is that to discuss, I believe that it is a good argument to discuss infinity, but whether we're going forwards or backwards, because we're talking eternity, we're talking about what happens when we die, we're talking about these things. We don't know. In some ways, faith might tell us we're going to have eternal life, but in some ways we don't know. No one's ever come back here to tell us about it.
Can you phrase this as a question?
Yeah, I guess what I'm getting at is that from a scientific standpoint, I'm trying to understand, how do you connect studies along these lines to a down-to-earth kind of way of looking at it, from what we're dealing with in this day and age, especially along the studies of historical Jesus and how we tie it in. And we're finding out a lot of the studies today are coming out that the Jesus we have may not be what we thought he was. And there's a lot of questions. Like he wrote a book about the resurrection and that. And I'm just trying to, I know I might be confusing a little bit, but I'm trying to find a connection between science and the life of Jesus. And if you can comment on that, I don't know if I've really brought a question to you, but I just want to keep comment along those lines.
Well, I don't think that the issue is relevant at all to what we're talking about today. I was surprised at all to see these biblical exegetical questions come up. But with respect to things like whether the doctrine of creation is an essential part of Christian faith, it doesn't have anything to do with the current attacks on gospel credibility or historical reliability or historical Jesus or anything of that sort, because this is a matter of doctrine, not historical events in terms of things recorded by eyewitnesses and so forth. So I think that that discussion that you want to talk about would be better reserved for another time. All right.
In the back.
Two questions, really. One, I was wondering if you could explain more concisely your theory on the simultaneity of cause and effect, because I think that that's fairly unintelligible. And my second question was, in much the same way that the Cartesian substance dualists have difficulty refuting their perspective, how would your second view of creation out of nothing be reconciled against the argument, the causal explanation that only like can cause like? That is, how do you have a material or physical time come out of something that is a sort of meta-time or something transcendental?
Okay, two questions. One on the simultaneity of cause and effect, and the second on the principle that only like can cause like.
I think the idea of the simultaneity of cause and effect is a very intuitive and everyday sort of notion. To borrow an example from Kant, a heavy ball resting on a pillow causes a depression in the pillow. And the effect, the depression, is simultaneous with the cause, the heavy ball resting on the cushion. So I think this is a very intuitive idea. In fact, when you think about it, as I say, if you actually say that the cause precedes the effect, it's very difficult to see how the effect could come to exist. Imagine that the cause exists up to, but not simultaneous with the effect, and then vanishes out of being. When the effect then occurs, it would literally be like coming out of nothing. It seems like the cause and the effect have to overlap.
Well, it would seem to me that would be two separate cause and effect relationships. One would be the releasing of the heavy ball, and its descending would be one cause and effect, the releasing and the descension. The second cause and effect relationship would be that once it hits the pillow, then it causes it to depress. And even so, both exist prior temporally to the interaction of the two.
I could have stated the example better. Imagine in that case that the ball has been resting on the cushion from eternity. I don't mean that you place the ball on the cushion and it causes a depression, but the ball has been resting from eternity on the cushion. Then the depression, the effect, is simultaneous at every moment with the cause, the heavy ball resting on it. Or imagine my, say, hanging this thing by the wire. The cause of its being suspended in the air is simultaneous with the effect. The effect, mainly this thing's being suspended, is simultaneous with the wire holding it up. We experience simultaneous causation, I think, just all the time. With regard to like producing like, I would say that physical time is really parasitic upon metaphysical time. The physical time is just, as Newton said, a sort of sensible measure of what real time is. So that, in a sense, physical time isn't really time itself. It's merely the motion of a hand around the face of a dial or something, or it's the movement of a light ray back and forth in a tube or something. That's all it is, and we just use that as a sensible measure of time itself. And it's only on a reductionistic view that you equate time with those operations, those physical operations. So it seems to me that physical time is merely a parasitic notion, a sensible measure of metaphysical time.
Well, conceding that much, then how would you explain that out of something completely different, being the meta-time that you were trying to relate with this respect?
Well, as I said, it actually presupposes the meta-time, that you couldn't have physical time as such without having metaphysical time. Imagine there were no metaphysical time. there were literally no time, well, then you couldn't have any physical time. You couldn't have any motion or change or anything. So that far from being a difficulty, it seems to me that the idea of this physical, sensible measure of time actually presupposes or entails this sort of metaphysical time. Do you want to
take one or two last questions, or no?
Just make one quick comment, since I'm responsible for raising this question about simultaneity of cause and effect. That's one of those tough metaphysical issues, and Professor Craig knows as well as I do that there are serious difficulties both with insisting that cause and effect are simultaneous and with the non. With respect to the classic example from Kant of the ball resting on a pillow, a good deal here hangs on how you individuate the relevant events that are causally related. And it seems to me the physically correct description of the situation is that the ball exerts a force on the pillow so that the depression that's caused in the pillow at a given time is the result of the force produced by the ball at an immediately preceding time. That seems to me to be the correct analysis of that particular case.
Is that then simultaneous or not? If it's immediately
I would
preceding.
argue no, but I mean, I think you have to talk about infinitesimals.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
in order to solve
I just wanted to make a quick comment on the way I think the way physics understands forces generally today, not just gravitational forces. Perhaps it's even easier to see with electromagnetic forces. The idea is that if you have charged particles, they emit photons, and the photons are absorbed by the other particle, and the result of emission and absorption of photons is what produces the force. But the idea here is that these are what you would call contact forces, in the sense that one particle doesn't feel the force until it's actually absorbed the photon from the other particle. So there's a sense in which it seems to me you can talk about these things being simultaneous in the sense of talking about contact forces. That's the kind of language that one does use sometimes in elementary particle physics.
I'd like to make one last comment, and that is, in addition to this, remember that when we think of God simultaneously causing the Big Bang, we're not talking about an exchange of physical forces in any case, because God doesn't act upon the universe through the mediation of physical causal chains. He simply immediately wills the universe into being, so that you don't have this difficulty of linking causal forces between God and the universe. Oh. Do you have an interest in the exegetical issues? You do? I see.
The efficient cause, I believe. I was wondering if you could tell how you don't get entangled with the problem of something from nothing. Something from nothing. I wonder if you could re-explain efficient cause and how you don't get caught with the problem of something from nothing.
How is the question of efficient cause related to the problem of getting something from nothing?
The whole idea of creation out of nothing is a very difficult and profound notion. On the atheistic view of the origin of the universe, you would say that the universe lacks both a material and an efficient cause. On the theistic view, it would mean that the universe lacks a material cause, but it does have an efficient cause at least. And so I would say that the theistic view is more intelligible in that it posits at least an efficient cause for the origin of the universe, even though the universe would lack a material cause.
One last question?
More a comment.
Comment? Sure.
As far as the idea of the quantum cosmology, which is the way to get around the singularity of physical theory, the creation from nothing is a well-accepted physical thing. Your quantum mechanics that you were describing, where creation out of nothing does not occur, is only in a flat space-time. As soon as the space-time is curved, and the example that we have is of a horizon of a black hole, then particles are created by the Hawking mechanism. It need not even be a strong gravitational field, it could just be a very large acceleration. And that's been known, that's very well worked out. So there, particles are created by a strong gravitational field, which is exactly the same thing that happens in the early universe. The warping of space and time is so great that particles can be created. So there is essentially creation out of nothing in particles due to an incredibly strong gravitational field. That's the way we understand it. How we actually piece it together when we actually try and do the quantum, make gravity itself quantum, not just the particles quantum, that we still don't know. That's what Bill was alluding to in his part of the talk. So I think it's wrong to say that quantum mechanics does not allow for creation from nothing. I also think, final comment, I also think it's wrong to describe elementary particles as if, say that maybe they're just it's an interpretation, but yet at the same time you're considering the Big Bang to be a fact. It seems like you can't have your cake, you're trying to have your cake and eat it. You're trying to say that one part of modern science is a fact, which will you appropriate to your purpose, and the other part of it maybe isn't, so maybe scientists do not have a true picture of what really reality is. I think both of those situations are on the same footing of reality.
I disagree with your interpretation of creation from nothing in curved spacetimes. I think this is just another illustration of the philosophically naive use of terms by many physicists, especially in popular writings, where they use terms like nothing to describe curved space-time or the quantum mechanical vacuum or a four-dimensional imaginary space-time. These are definitely not nothing. These are physical entities that have describable properties. Even in the way you stated it, you said the particles are created due to the gravitational field. It's not nothing. So that this is a philosophically, I think, misleading use of the term. Now, with respect to realism versus non-realism, I don't think it's an all or nothing affair. You can certainly be a realist about some scientific theories and not be a realist about others. And I think that probably there are not very many people who would be so courageous as to be hardy realists about particle physics, because this is so incredibly speculative.
I disagree totally, because that's my job. And I also study cosmology and gravity, and I disagree thoroughly with what you're talking about.
Well, I don't know how to adjudicate this because it's just sort of a tis-taint. I mean, I know the literature too, and I don't think that if you were to ask most philosophers of science, for example, do quarks really exist? I think very few would be willing to say, yes, quarks exist in the same sense that, say, dinosaurs exist, or tapeworms exist, or things of that sort. These are theoretical entities which are posited to explain certain empirical phenomena, but it's not always clear whether or not we should be realistic about these.
What about the electron?
Even that, I think that's a matter of debate.
Well, I just wanted to mention two things here. First of all, to argue that many physicists